Okay, again, it gives me great pleasure to introduce my own father, Rabbi Dr. Leo Davids, to the second lecture in a two-part lecture series. Tonight's topic is the origins and the history of the Gemara, both from a halachic perspective as well as a historical perspective. My father was born in Amsterdam, grew up in New York, and spent close to the past 50 years in Toronto, and was a member of the faculty at York University, where he was well known for his teaching. And in the past few years, my parents have been spending their winters here in Israel.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I understand that tonight we're bucking against various other events, big events. I know that the crowd 2 weeks ago was bigger, but I guess maybe there were not as many football games or book launches or other things going on at the time. In any case, I do indeed want to speak tonight about the history of Talmud. Talmud, of course, is a bit of a complex thing, as people know. We'll talk about the sort of basic structure in a minute, but basically Talmud consists of Mishnah, and then either a Yerushalmi Gemara, as we call it, the Gemara of Eretz Yisrael, or the Gemara of Bavel, the Bavli. When you take together Mishnah and a Gemara, either the Israeli Gemara or the Mesopotamian Gemara, either one, that's a Talmud. So, again, we'll get to that a little later, but basically, this is where we're going to try to figure it all out. Now, I will start again with thanking, as I did a couple of weeks ago, thanking Rabbi Kelman, and the rabbi of the shul, who's not present again, he's out of town, Rabbi Ozenberg. Thank Ellie, of course, who helps out in various ways, and the local volunteers. We have a gentleman here who came and got everything going. We had some people last time as well, who were very kind to put out some nash, so we're well supplied. Now, the basic terminology of Talmud, just to start with the sort of the definitions, we're talking about a literary structure which consists of what are called in Aramaic masechtot, and in English they usually use the Latin term tractate. It's from Latin, tractate meaning it treats of or it deals with something. So, for example, tractate Shabbos deals with Shabbos, tractate Psachim deals with Psachim, etc. So some of them are very simple to see what the topic is. In other cases, not so obvious. In any case, within the tractate, within the Masechta, of course, there are prakim. There are prakim with the human body, but joined from here to here, perek. We don't mean perek in that sense, a chapter. And the chapters indeed have other smaller units. We speak of a daf, which is a two-sided page. Fancy Latin, they use the term folio, from the Latin for leaves. So folio 1, folio 2, etc., etc. But the Gemaras don't start, the printed Gemaras that we have in the last few centuries don't have a daf aleph. They start with bet. The first daf in every Masechta is daf bet, not daf aleph. You say, why is that? So to remind you that we haven't even begun to learn. Okay. So this is very standard stuff. Now, there are two types of chachamim, two types of rabbis, sages, who are involved in production of a Talmud. The sages of the Mishnah, which is the same for the Mesopotamian and the Galilean version, and the sages later on of the Gemara. Okay, the earlier sages, the ones who are in the Mishnah themselves, are quoted, referred to, they have things to say, are called Tanaim, which means scholars, if you will. And Amoraim are the scholars of the Gemara, and Amoraim really means mouthpiece, loudspeaker. It means someone who's not in any way the originator of the content, but is simply carrying it forward. So the Amoraim, the sages of the Gemara, didn't see themselves as in any way innovating, leading, initiating, nothing of the sort. It's the Tanaim who have provided the important content. We Amoraim, we are the scholars of the Gemara. We are simply announcers and voice carriers. Now, this was typical in those days. We'll speak about it a bit later, when you had a large crowd to learn. Not the serious learners, who were very small crowds, But the big crowds, when you had Shabbos afternoon and Yom Tov afternoon, those crowds, you had always the Rabbi who provided the content, and a young guy with good lungs who would bellow it out to the crowd. They didn't have, mics and loudspeakers and so on. If they had them, they would say Shabbos, Shabbos. They couldn't use it anyway. So this young guy would hear from the sage, would hear what he wanted to say. He spoke very quietly to him. And this guy who spoke the local, whatever the local dialect was, spoke it well. He would get up there and he would, and then hundreds of people could hear it. And so this is the way things went. So the Gemara scholars as well, the sages, consider themselves merely Amoraim, Iberzugers in plain Yiddish. I talked about Yiddish 2 weeks ago. Iberzugers, they're just people who transmit the words, but they're not the ones who provide the content. This is very, very basic. The basic cutoff between Tanaim and Amoraim is about the year 200. 200 Common Era. Before 200 Common Era, the sages, generally speaking, are Tanaim. Roughly, but at 90, 200. After that, once the 200 and over, you have already what I called Amoraim. Okay, this is the Iberzugers. Okay, now, why we have two separate Gemaras and why we always learn Bavli and not Yerushalmi, all these sort of questions we'll have to get to a bit later, and we have probably a few minutes afterwards for questions, and if I forget to put in something or if I overlook something you wanted to talk about, we'll try to fill in later on. Okay. There is a great issue, a great problem, a challenge in this whole idea of having Talmud, having Mishnah Gemara, which is in front of us on the handout sheet. We'll look at that in a second. And really, what we see is several places within the Gemara itself, within the Talmud Bavli, which we commonly use, in which the whole question of having Talmud written rather than oral law, oral is supposed to be spoken and heard and not supposed to be written. This issue, in fact, is raised within several Gemaras. I saw the one in Gittin, Daf Samach Amud Beis. This is a better text in Tamura Yodal and Amud Beis. This text here, in fact, is a bit more complete, a bit more comprehensive in dealing with the issue, both the question and the answer. So why don't we take a look at the big issue that the Gemara itself discusses when they say, well, how can this be written? I mean, it's just not appropriate. Let's look at this in the text that we handed out in Tamura. And as I say, that some of the same stuff is in Git and Daf Samach on the base, but this is a better version. Now, here you have not just the question, but you have the answer, but very, very briefly. The long answer I'm going to try to provide over the next 40 minutes. The short answer is here in a few lines. 14b1, 14b2, the way they do it in the Art Scroll Gemaras. If you look at the first column on 14b1, the lower part of it, the lower part of the first column on the left side of 14b1, it says, V'i havale igarta. It translates, if Rav Dimi would have had the opportunity to send a letter, he would have sent him which is the last line of the first side of Amud Aleph. It gets into that. And the Gemara says, look, it's a strange thing here. Would it have been permitted for him to send such a letter? If he had a letter, he would have sent it to so-and-so. About what the halacha should be and how it works with Nesachim, and Nesachim will be brought by day, by night. That's the issue that we're getting into. He says, what do you permit to send a letter? He says, let's look at this. It's strong language, very strong language. Rav Abba, the son of Rav Chia bar Abba, said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Now, in terms of the Emoraim of Bavel, the big names in the first generation of Emoraim, of the Gemara scholars, that is from 200 and onwards, the two big names were Rav and Shmuel. That was in Babylon, right, in Babylonian Talmud. In Eretz Yisrael, the big name, the Gadol Hador, was Rabbi Yochanan. Yochanan, he was the guy. So they quote Rabbi Yochanan. He says the following. Now look at this. Kosvei halachos kesoref haTorah. Those who write down the laws of the oral Torah like one who burns the Torah. Burns. Whoa. And if one studies from these manuscripts, they gain no reward. Now we're talking, this is tough stuff. Okay? And the Gemara continues and goes on. And on the second column of 14b1, on the right side, you see the following. Dorish Rabbi Yehuda bar Nachmani to Gemara Dorish Lakish. There was an interpretation made by Yehuda bar Nachmani, who was Meturgamon, the young guy with the lungs. Remember the young guy with the lungs who speaks the vernacular very well? He was Meturgamon serving Resh Lakish. Shimon ben Lakish.
What does Meturgaman mean?
Meturgaman, which say today is a translator, but in those days it was really the guy who bellowed out the text. The sage spoke to him quietly, and he did it for the crowd, so hundreds could follow what they were saying. Right? This Meturgaman who served Resh Lakish. He said the following: Kosovech Omer. This is a long time ago. We heard this in the Parsha. I mean Shabbos, like 3 days ago. It was this week's Parsha, the end of Kisisa. One verse states, "Kasov l'chos hadvar ma'ila." Write for yourself these words, which indicates that the Torah is to be written. Then in the other part of the pasuk, the same pasuk by the way, not another verse, the same verse, but just a little later on, it says, "Ki al pi hadvar ma'ila karati l'chavos." Al pi hadvar ma'ila. Al pi seems to mean al peh. So that indicates, can be interpreted by mouth, it alludes to the laws that are orally transmitted. There seems to be a contradiction. However, this is not a contradiction. Continuing down the column, you see where I'm at. Lo malach, to tell you. Devarim shemal peh iyata rashoy la'omron b'chsav. Teachings that were given to you orally, you are not permitted to transmit in writing. However, sheb'chsav, teachings that were given to you in writing, in other words, chumash, as we call it, that you are not permitted to transmit orally. In fact, there are questions about being able to say any chumash text by heart. So Tosfos says that by heart we know it so well, and it's that terms. If you look at the Tosfos here, but that is not material to us at the moment. In any case, you're not permitted to transmit orally, right? Furthermore, another sort of explanation of the same idea, saying you may not mix Torah b'chsav, Torah sheba'al peh. You're supposed to have, if it's written, that's only written. If it's oral, it's supposed to stay oral, right? Which raises the question of how can we have a Talmud, which is our big issue here. The Brisa says the following: Ksav l'chos hadvorim ha'eleh. Write for yourself these words. In my little copy, I underlined the word these. These words write down. In other words, the words of Chumash you may write, right? But you may not write. Going on to 14b2, right, in the next little page there. Einatok kosev halachas, you never write orally transmitted laws. In light of all that, how could Rav Dimian propose sending Rav Yosef his reconciliation of the Brises by letter? He would be allowed to tell him an answer to a halachic question by letter. Not supposed to write. That's what the Gemara is doing here. But that is clearly the question. That is clearly the challenge. Now the Gemara now begins the answer. In Gittin, if you look at the Rashi in Gittin, it gives the answer in 2 words. 2 words, and I think they are Shahatorah Mishtakachas. The Torah is being forgotten. That's a 2-word answer from Rashi. But Rashi, why is Rashi Rashi? Because he can put tremendous amounts of content in very few words, tiny. The question is always, if you see Rashi's 2 words, what's the background? Where's it coming from? What's he dealing with? But that Rabbi Bonchik had put out book after book, which he's dealt with that. Those bothering Rashi, famous series. Okay. A psychologist used to teach at Stern way back in the old days. Anyway, now, Gemara begins the answer as follows. He said, you know what? Dilma milsa chadata shani. Number one, perhaps there is an exception. It's perhaps, they're not sure. Perhaps an exception, if it's something novel, something new, it's a chiddush, hey, maybe you can write it down. Why? You see, Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish, they were big Emeroim in Eretz Yisrael, in their time. They would examine a book of Agadata on the Shabbos. They would look in Agadata book for Shabbos. Why for Shabbos? Because they were still going to darshan for the tzibur. And for the tzibur, unlike the professional scholars who are full-timers, the tzibur that comes to learn are laborers a whole week. They have a business, they have a water trade, drinkers, whatever they are. But Shabbos, they come to learn for a couple hours. If you don't give them Agadata, you lost them before you said 2 words. So they had look in the book of Agadata. They have something that's Moshe Kasalev and gets them to pay attention and holds the ear a little bit. And then they could come with the halachic content afterwards, and the audience would be with them. And if you didn't have the Agadata, forget about it. Okay? So they looked in the Sefer Agadata to have some good words to kind of grab the crowd. Because these are not professional learners. These are people who work for a living and who only come Shabbos. So on Shabbos they needed to do this. So how can you allow that? You say maybe there's a heter. What would that be based on? What? Well, it's a poskim tillim. They expound in a verse that just other actions. Eis lasos lashem heferu torosechem. This is in the letter Ayin in the big Tehillim Kuf Yutes 119, which contains the whole alphabet, Aleph, Beis, Gimel, each one 8 psukim. Aleph, Aleph, Aleph 8 times, Beis, Beis, Beis 8 times, right? You get to, Ayin, one of the 8 psukim of Ayin is Eis Lasos Lashem Hivir Torosem. When it is a time to act for Hashem, nullify the Torah. Whoa, nullify the Torah, what does that mean? Amri, they can say, Mutov she'te'aker Torah, but ishtakeach Torah Yisrael. Some have the girsa te'aker os min Torah. I mean, there are different girsas, but the basic idea is, it is preferable that one letter of the Torah be uprooted. In other words, the law that prohibits transcribing the oral law to write it down, that be pushed aside. So the Torah itself should not be forgotten from Israel. So the problem is, should not be forgotten. The question is, why are they worried about forgotten at this time, the time of Mishnah and Gemara? And before that, centuries went by, they didn't think they had forgotten that very much. Well, there was a danger of forgetting. And now what danger of forgetting? Why? Well, let's look at the history, let's look at Rome, let's look at oppression, persecution, etc. And we'll have some answers to those questions. So this is basically the Gemara, question, answer. The answer is brief. We're going to have to flesh it out, that answer, a great deal. So far, so good? Yeah? Okay. All right, now we go on. Now, we have to, in order to really understand the writing of the Talmud at that time, in those places, we have to know what the Goyim are up to.
One could really say that Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish had these books for themselves. They did not transmit it to somebody else, contradistinction to Rav Dimi, who did want to transmit something to someone else.
It's a good point, and you're quite right. We look in the historical record, we find that before Rabbi Yehuda Nossi did his thing, all kinds of people had Tanaic texts in writing, but they were private notebooks. They were somebody's little scroll they kept for themselves. Was not published, was not transmitted to others. It wasn't canonical in any way. That was their text for themselves, their convenience. That the people did privately. But to do something and say, this is the word, that was a whole different departure, which we're coming back to shortly. In any case, so we want to know not just what the Jews were doing, but we want to know what the Goyim were doing to the Jews. If we figure that out, we'll begin to see that there are different environments for scholarship. Some of them are easier and some of them are harder. Some of them are very scary in terms of, will this stuff be lost? And some of them are, discussion. We're doing okay, we'll manage. Okay. Let's look at the politics. Let's look at scholarly initiative. Let's look at a lot of things. First of all, the elephant in the room, or not in this room, but the elephant in the whole story is Rome. And what Rome was doing to the Jews for centuries. And what Rome was doing was big persecution. And if somebody committed a sin, like circumcising their child, of course they would be killed. And if they did keep the Shabbos in some obvious way, they'd be crucified. Crucifixion is not, some religious things reserved for our Christian friends. Crucifixion was a standard Roman thing to hang people on a wall and make sure that that would be seen by everybody as a very scary thing, so as to stop them doing whatever the Romans didn't want them to do. So what happens is that for centuries, okay, before you get to Rabbi Yehuda Nossi, you have the Roman persecutions. And if anybody is talking Torah in public, achas dos olahamis, and there's no milvada shiorset lo hamelach, a shabbat hazah, there's no shabbat hazah. Achas dos olahamis, guy teaching Torah in public, circumcises a child, off with his head, hang him on a wall. This is the way things went. Now you're not talking about a short period, you're talking about centuries. The Romans came in when you had the late Chashmonoim, before Herod, before Herodos. The Romans started to come in, they were there, and then it started. And the Romans were there in what the Christians called the 1st, 2nd centuries, 3rd century. They were there all the time. And the Romans didn't really disappear until the Roman Empire was in a bad state of dissolution in the 300s. Before the Vandals came by, the Vandals? They came by and wrecked the place. That was already 410. But during the 300s, the Romans were fighting each other. And who will be the next emperor? I'll be the emperor, he'll be the emperor. And the armies were killing each other to put up this emperor, support that emperor. So at that point already, the Jews didn't have to worry. But by that time, the Christians had become well established. And they can make source for the Jews. Christians made, from the 300s on, the Christians were well established. They became the official religion of the Roman Empire in its latter days. So, anyway, if you want to know what the Jews are doing, you're going to have to look at what the Goyim are up to. In any case, so for centuries there was repression, Judaism was repressed, circumcision was banned, public Torah study was terrible, etc., etc., etc. And many gruesome wars, executions, etc., etc. Eventually, in fact, what happens, and I'll give you some numbers, historical dates in a minute. What happened eventually is that Judea, Eretz Yehuda, is basically destroyed. Just destroyed by all this source for decades and centuries. And in fact, the whole scholarly community shifts to the north, to Galil. So when you have the Kivrei HaTanoim, you don't look for them around Yerushalayim where you might expect them to be. Tiberia, Tzipori, all over the Galil. Because Judea being destroyed by the Romans and the wars and the Tsuras, people moved up north where they had some breathing space that was still in Eretz Yisrael. And the people who stayed in Babylon, stayed in Babylon. If we come to Eretz Yisrael, we'll have Tsuras with the Romans, we're better off staying where we are. So they did stay. In any case, the situation in Mesopotamia was better. Now, what happens, of course, is that the Romans are fighting with the Jews in the 60s, common era 60s, all right? And at the end, finally, 69, 70, around there, the Beis HaMikdash, the Beit Sheni, is destroyed by the Romans, completely. Titus, Gesheft, and Vespasian. I mean, you can read the whole Tisha B'Av thing yourself and see a lot of the history. Slichas are there, and Aquinos, and whatever. In any case, this is 69, 70. Now you might think, well, that was the end of it. I mean, Rome won, finished. Not the end of it at all. Because in 132, 133, 134, the Jews rebelled, led by the fearsome Bar Kokhba. And Bar Kokhba was a big guy, and he was tough, and he was capable. And for a few years, people said, this is the Mashiach. Look what he's doing. In time of the Hanukkah War, okay, which was centuries before, the Jews did well, unexpectedly. Giborim Biad Chaloshim, right? Rabbi Biad Matim, etc. They thought it was a Bar Kokhba would happen again. It didn't quite work out. So finally, Bar Kokhba was in his big city called Beitar. We know Beitar today, which is not quite the same thing, but okay. And Beitar fell with the Roman onslaught, and rivers of blood, tens of thousands killed, horrendous, in 135. So the temples were destroyed already, 65 years earlier, and they're still fighting a war, and the Jews are not able to hold up. Eventually they have recognized this is not working. Now, what the Gemara tells us in Gittin, we'll come back to it later, the famous meeting with Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and so on, we'll get to a little easier. Now, when you get the Roman Empire, it stretches from Scotland, from the Scottish border, okay, where you have today Gateshead Yeshiva, that kind of thing. That's the edge of England. From Scotland, it stretches out to Syria. Now, somewhere in Syria, somewhere near the Euphrates, is the eastern edge of the Roman Empire. Beyond that, the Persians are in charge. And the Persians, nobody can push around. Not now and not then. Persians are tough guys, and they... So in their area, they were the eastern boundary of the Roman Empire, because the Romans couldn't go any further. Once they got to where the Persians are, somewhere around the Tigris River, the Roman Empire didn't expand any further east. That was it. That was the eastern limit. The Jews who were still there from the time of the destruction of Bais Rishon were sitting in Babylonia. It was under the Persians, under this and that. They were in a much better situation. They were economically wealthier there. They were politically much freer. The Roman Empire, with all the terrible stuff that was going on, didn't reach there because the Persians said, this is our territory, you're not coming any further. And they stopped. The Jews, therefore, who were in Mesopotamia and eastward, were not under the Romans, and they were able to do things that couldn't be done in Eretz Yisrael without going underground and so on. So this is where there's a tremendous difference in the milieu, in the environment, for scholars of Torah in Eretz Yisrael, who had a very hard time, the scholars of Torah in what we call Bavel, today Iraq, but there and then further east, who were under the Persians and who were protected, therefore, from the Romans.
There were very few Tanoim there.
In where? In
Bavel.
Right. Tanoim, to leave Eretz Yisrael and to do Torah outside Eretz Yisrael, if you're a Tana, it's like, horrendous. They have a whole thing about Rabbi Akiva, it was Ma'aber Shonim and so on, and he wasn't in Eretz Yisrael because he ran away to wherever, Turkey or someplace. But I said, well, Lo Hiniach Kemosav, right? Eretz Yisrael. But other than that, out Kimitzion Teitzei Sorah, B'Hashem Yerushalayim, you're supposed to be in Eretz Yisrael to learn anything serious. Later on, time Amaroim, you can do that in Bible too. But anyway, so coming back to the story that we're into is the following. Before we get to Yavne v'Chachamea, which I'm coming to a little later, the famous, the Romans spared that town. But before we come to that, how was Torah learned before Mishnah, before Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, how was Torah learned? So as I said to you earlier, there are two ways Torah is learned, and it's quite different. One is the way Torah is learned for the professionals, for the full-timers, for what's called in the Gemara, Survam Rabbanon, someone who is a young scholar and is learning sort of full-time. And on the other hand, the masses who work, and then comes Shabbos, Yom Tov, then you have a chance to learn a little bit, but it's a few hours. Remember this keta from, this comes to my mind now, from Chayoro or something, saying, "Oisim balabatim she'ena lomdim kiyim gimel v'dalet shoas bayom, ... It's like kiyim, you know? Okay, that's the sideline. So how was Torah learned? Okay, let's talk about it. The young scholars, the full-timers, how did they learn Torah? I'll tell you how they did it. They took out a Sefer Torah from the Ark, they put it down on the reading desk, and they opened it up. And they said, today we're going to take a look at this and this parsha, which is 2-3 psukim, but we're going to really spend some time on it. And then the Rabbi, who knew all this stuff, he would look at the thing with the guys and say, look guys, what do you see here? This letter is large, yeah, this letter is small, yeah, there's a dot here, there's a little crown on, you know. What does this tell us? So all these things in the Sefer Torah were hooks on which to hang all kinds of oral stuff. And if you spent many, many hours paying attention to it, you could open a Sefer Torah, and instead of just reading the pasuk, you could expound on that same pasuk for an hour or two with all of the peshivkas. And you could add the stuff. Why? Because your Rebbe taught it to you that way. So the guys were there, the only text they had was the Sefer Torah itself. They knew Nevi'im Miksuvim fairly well, but you don't learn halacha from Nevi'im Miksuvim in general. Odd time you do, but it's considered Gila Milsa, not a problem. In any case, they had the Sefer Torah, and they learned in the Sefer Torah. And as they said, Eila HaMishpatim Asher Tosim Lifneihem, and they would take 3-4 psukim, they could be busy on it for I don't know how many weeks and weeks and weeks. Right? But these were the full-timers. On the other hand, popular education was very important, and that happened in non-working times. And therefore, Shabbos afternoon, if you were learning by yourself Shabbos afternoon, not coming to the public shiur, you were in a varya, because you're destroying the community. I mean, I still say that to people all the time. I say, Rabbi gives Pirkei Avos before mincha. Some of you have been through Pirkei Avos a few times yourselves. Rabbi gives Pirkei Avos, you've got to be there. Why? The Torah is very strong as someone who doesn't come to the big public shiur, everybody's together, they're all there. Not to come to Pirkei Avos, I know better, I learn, but chavrusa, Okay, anyway, I mean, I have my hang-ups, you know, I'm telling you what some of them are. In any case, Shabbos afternoon, people would gather in big groups, and you had the sage speaking very softly to the emora, to the Meturgamon, to the broadcaster, and the young guy would get up there and speak whatever the local dialect was, and tell him blah, 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 and would say it, and so on. How much did he change the message on the way was sometimes an issue. Because, you know, when you play telephone games, and he said X, and he said X plus a tiny bit, sometimes there were some chikuchim, there were some frictions between the guy who gave the original text and the Meturgamon who rendered it in a way that kind of gave it a certain twist, whatever. But by and large, Meturgamon's job was simply to bring to the people what the message was in their language, loudly, and so on. So this is the way public education went. And then, of course, Shabbos and Yom Tov was when it was going to be done. Now, in later times when around 200 CE and afterwards you had Rav, Shmuel, these people, they wanted public education to be more than, you know, an hour here and 2 hours there. Shabbos and Yom Tov alone, the learning would be weak. So they instituted a whole system which is called the Kala, Yarchei Kala. Yarchei Kala means that people would take seasons when the agricultural business was quiet, and it was the end of the summer or the end of the winter or whatever, and things weren't busy on the fields, and people could actually sit and learn for 4 weeks. They would do a month, Yerach. Yerach is a month. Yarchei Kala, a month when it's, you know, what they call in modern Catholic language a retreat. The Jews would have a retreat. They could spend a month. Then you learn for 4 weeks seriously every day. Okay, they could do that seasonally, you know, when it was a quiet time, it was before Rosh Hashanah or whatever, then they could do that. That was a somewhat later innovation. So we know a little bit of how Torah was learned when you had no Mishnah, your only text was the Sefer Torah itself. You had to work very, very hard with all the tiny little hints to kind of remember things, etc., etc. And the full-time scholars finally got this into their heads. They could look at the pasuk, then they could talk for hours and hours and hours. And the popular people had some exposure to Torah all the time. The minimal exposure to Torah, of course, goes back to Ezra Sofer. He said that we have to read the Torah Monday and Thursday mornings. Why? We don't want people to go 3 days without Torah. If a Jew goes 3 days without Torah, he loses his mind or whatever. In any case, so we have Shabbos Torah, obviously. We have Torah reading in the morning, we have Torah reading Shabbos afternoon. We have public lessons, and then Monday and Thursday do not have, you know, a big open wasteland. Okay. Now, before Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi is the Nasi from 163 CE onwards. Right? Before him, there were all kinds of Tanaim who were under the Romans as well, and they knew that the yeshivot in Eretz Yisrael were under pressure, and you couldn't learn Torah publicly. And if they caught people teaching Torah, they would fill their bodies with lances and all this other thing, right? Remember the guy who was giving smicha to 5 said, run, 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 he can't run. All kinds of swords with the Romans. So we know that Rabbi Akiva already had some halachic texts which he kept sort of privately for himself. Then Rabbi Meir had a Mishnah kind of building up already, but it was unofficial, it was private, it was somebody's little notebook on a scroll, and so on. These things were allowed only because they were private and they were not transmitted to other people. They had no formal standing whatsoever. Okay. However, what happens is that after centuries of tzoros from the Romans, the Jews got a break. I don't mean on a bone. They got a break in that they had a window of quiet. And that was under 2 emperors. Okay. Now, before the 2 emperors, which is well after the Churban, we'll just jump back for a moment to the time of the Churban. Jerusalem is under siege. The end is near. Everybody sees that the tzoros are coming in another few weeks, whatever. The time is finished. It's quite obvious. The Rabbi Mizrahi is carried out in a coffin. They make believe he's dead. You know the whole thing. Is Gittin Daf Nun Vav on the base. And Gittin Nun Vav says that he came to see the guy who was going to become emperor imminently. At that time he was the general, then later is going to become declared emperor. And the discussion between the Tana who was there and the Roman leader was, what are you here for? What are you looking for? He says, I need a couple favors. So he asked for a couple favors. The famous one that we all see quoted is Tenli Yavne B'Chachamea. Now Yavne was far away from Yerushalayim. It was already a Torah center. People, excuse me, people went there. Maybe it was built up already as a lifeboat in advance. It could be that they needed a quiet place in the country, far away from the capital city where the politics were. Could be that it was for other reasons a town of Torah already. So Tenli Yavne doesn't mean we're going to start now to learn at Yavne the first time. We have an established center. Allow me to have my guys there doing their thing. Don't bother us in that town. He says, okay. He also wanted this. He wanted a doctor to help Rabbi Tzorah, but that's not our concern here. I'm saying they weren't good. In any case, what happens when the Churban has actually occurred? Now it's the year 70, 71, 72. The survivors are dazed. They're shocked. Everything has changed. Their world has been turned totally upside down. The Beis HaMikdash is ashes. The way of life of Torah, mitzvos, maybe ashes too, who knows? It was a really terrible, scary time. And it was something which emotionally was, massive. What would become of the traditions and heritage of Am Yisrael, of Yahadus, of Torah, of all the things we have lived by, we and our ancestors, for so many centuries? And all of a sudden, what's going to be? Where's it going to go? Okay. So, they got to Yavne, and what they did really at Yavne after the Churban, they started what we would call salvage work. If you have something that sank, you have a salvage boat, they come with divers, they put up hooks and they try to get from the wreckage whatever they can. They said, look, you know what? We have to do salvage work here. So what did they do? They took testimonies from people who could talk about the Beis HaMikdash, how it was built, and where the Kohanim came and went, and the Karbonos, all things that they knew were not going to be seen again very soon. They didn't know when it might be seen again, but it was going to be a while. They assumed that, that's coming back really fast. So if we don't get this down from people who have seen the Beis HaMikdash when it was standing and functioning, what will our grandchildren know about the Beis HaMikdash and anything that went on there? So if we don't write it down now, mipi ele sheyotim, it's going to be lost. So what happens is they create something which we can see, which is the panic Masechta. Panic Masechta is called edios. Every Masechta, usually tractate means you treat something, you deal with something. Shabbos is about Shabbos, right? Sanhedrin is about the court. This Masechta is just about everything and nothing. And in all directions. It has no content at all, it's just panic Masechta. So they sit a young man, and they say, Rabbi Elazar, what do you remember? Four different halachas in four totally different areas. They write it down. Hey, Rabbi Elazar, this and this and this. Then they go next one. Rabbi Shimon, what do you know? Oh, I only know about this and this and this. Tell me. Write it down. What's the content of edios? Anything and whatever. Quick, grab it, salvage. We're panicking, we're writing it down fast. That's edios, which before we get Mishnah in an organized fashion, we have that. Okay? So this is what you get in many different topics and so on. Now, let's come back to the window, when the Jews had a window of opportunity, and that is the following. Marcus Aurelius, known to us in the Gemara as Antoninus. Antoninus for Rabbi. Fancy name was Marcus Aurelius. He became emperor around 161, 162. Rabbi became the Nasi in 163. So, not only do you have a window, you have somebody who can go through the window too. Right? Because you get a new emperor who's okay with the Jews. He admires wisdom, cleverness. This guy, Rabbi Yonasi, smart fellow. He's wealthy. I mean, that's obviously a recommendation. He lives nicely, has an estate, comes on a nice horse, he dresses like that. He speaks Hebrew, Latin, beep, ba, 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 boom. And with him you can talk. In Latin, obviously. What else? So he's reigning 161, 162. He dies in 180. He's succeeded by his son Commodus. And Commodus from 180 to 192 is also a good guy. The Jews are very clever, they're very nice. The streets of Agrippa's here are filled with Chinese. Why are the streets filled with Chinese in Yerushalayim? The Jews are clever, they figure to rub off. They come here to get wisdom. Right? They're not here to sightsee, they want to see the building. They want to learn something from the Jews. Anyway, so between Marcus Aurelius and Commodus, you had about 30 years of peace. Not of war, but of peace. It was quiet and restful. And Rabbi Nasi is a wealthy man and a genius, and he's the head of the Jews. He's in a position, both outside the environment around the Jews and within the Jewish world, to do this tremendous project which we call Mishnah. And eventually Rabbi Nasi says, look, it's quiet now. Heaven knows what it'll be in 50 years from now. Change emperors, reset. Every time you hit emperor, you hit a reset button. You know what you're going to get on the next show. So the emperors now, they're good guys. You do what you want. You're very nice, clever people. We admire learning, sophistication, blah, blah, blah. The other guy might say, down with the Jews again, like the old guys used to say. So in any case, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, he was able to collect Mishnah of Rabbi Meir or Rabbi Akiva, the private collections of Torah Sheba'al Peh. He put it together, he organized it, and he shaped it all into what we know as Mishnah. 63 tractates. There's more than there needed to be because some are so big they had to divide it. So we have a tractate called Nezikin. It's got 3 parts. Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, Bava Basra. It's really one tractate, but there's 3 tractates.
The private collections were each individual owned persons, or there were collections of others? Rabbi Akiva,
in Rabbi Akiva's Beis Medrash, no doubt he had recorded some things of other people who learned with him in the same place. And Rabbi Meir, where he learned with Acher and other people, he would have written down those things not just from himself, but there were other. If you were in the same Beis Medrash, they would have written. So Rabbi Yehuda is able to collect these things, put them together, use some of the existing texts, add to other stuff, and make 63 tractates in 6 Siddharim, 6 orders. So 6 orders, so you have 11 here, 12 there, 11 there, until you get 63 in the 6 orders. And now it's legitimate and official. Why is legitimate and official? Because it's Posek and Tehillim. Eis Lazos Lashem. They're doing it for God's sake, not because they want to be, convenient for themselves and not trouble their heads. Because the danger is very real. If you're a Torah Sefer, you'll have to nullify something. The Torah says Torah Sheba'al Peh is supposed to be Baal Peh, but in this case it's going to be something else. However, what Rabbi did really is not quite to break the old rule in pieces. Because if you give somebody headlines and hints and very brief things, which don't require explaining and teaching and and footnotes, you haven't quite put it all in writing. It's somewhat between not written and written, but written in such a way that you cannot say, I don't need a teacher anymore, I'll figure it all out myself. I'll read the Septuagint, I'll see what they mean. You know, the Torah Shebeksav, once you do the Septuagint, the Jews were very unhappy. Chacham were very unhappy that they translated the Bible into Greek or Tanakh. Because everybody's saying, I'll interpret it for myself. Read the Greek, and I'll tell you what it means, the way I understand it. So you don't want to do that. In any case, Rabbi's Mishnah still needs teachers, still needs explanations, but it's a beginning. Now, because of the Roman and then Christian persecutions,
Was it just organization or writing down?
you have to write text, not just organize.
You
You
did
can
write
organize
text,
something.
you
Huh?
You think he wrote text?
He wrote text. Sure, he wrote text. He had text from others. He collected them, put them together. When text was missing, he wrote text. But then he organized it. He had a place to put it, and so on and so on. One Panic Masech is from the early days of Yavner right after the Churban, which is Edios. Everything else has a subject matter. This is Psachim, is Psachim. This is Sukkah, is Sukkah, right? Whereas Edios is everything and anything, whatever they can quickly grab, just to get it down on the scroll before we, lose the guy.
Is it mentioned anywhere that he did write?
What's that?
Is it mentioned anywhere that he did write it?
It may be mentioned. I mean, obviously, you cannot have 63 Masechtas put out at his time, 188, 190 finished, and say none of it is new text. It's all taken from existing. It's inconceivable that it should all have been available, all of it from previous. If you take pieces, you have to fill in, you have to add, you have to. I'm sure he had to write some text where he didn't have existing text from before. In any case, the Roman and Christian persecutions, which were going 200, 300, and so on, finally closed down the Galilean yeshivas. They had left Judea, the Jews. Okay, all the scholars were now in Galilee, but even there, eventually they just couldn't hold out. And so the Gemara Yerushalmi, Gemara being discussions flowing from the Mishnah, contradictions, explanations, sources, okay? And these things are carried on in the language that Jews spoke, which was not Hebrew anymore. Hebrew was just dying out as a spoken language in the time of Rabbi. And we find in the Gemara many interesting things when they needed to know what a Hebrew meant and they no longer used it themselves. And who knew Hebrew? Who was the Hebrew expert? Not Ben Yehuda, but Amsei the Rebbe, Rebbe's handmaid. If they needed to know something, here's a strange word in Navi, I don't know what this is about. Amsei the Rebbe came from a household in which Hebrew was spoken elegantly and full-time. It was one of the last few. And she, the maidservant by Rabbi, she was the one who could, deal with this difficult Hebrew words. Because the language has gone out of general use. This is already 150 years after the Churban. It's, not there anymore. It's Aramaic. So the Gemaras are written in Aramaic. The Mishnah is written still in Hebrew. Just Arayin Gechabt Hebrew when people could still sort of make out what it was saying. And so the Yerushalmi is concluded because of the Tzuras, okay, around 350-ish. 300, 350. The Yerushalmi is brought to an end. They just can't continue. They simply have to give it up prematurely. On the other hand, until the Persians and so on in the East, in Bavel, the Gemara process went on for longer. And that was edited and finished around the year 500 CE. So you had 100 years, 150 years longer development, maturation, kind of putting together of the Babli, Ravina Ravashi, than what you had in Yerushalmi. The Gemara that we understand more easily is a little longer, it's said more clearly, it's language we can understand, etc., is the Babli. When we talk about learning Gemara, you learn Babli in 97% of the times, and 3% is for Grace Mention, who can learn Yerushalmi. But all of us are learning Babli. This is what we normally have as our standard. Now, just to wrap up, later on, of course, the Gemara Babli was made much more nagish, much more approachable, accessible, when you had great rabbis like Rashi, okay, who would comment and would put in what the words mean and so on, and then you could actually work with it. That comes much later. The Gemara is finished in 500. Rashi is 5 to 6 centuries later. So for 500 years, people knocked their heads on the brick wall. Rashi came along and opened up the lights a little bit. Oh, wow. And after him, of course, all the other people, the Rambam came, Persian Mishnah, Rambam, and Mishnah Torah. So these people, of course, work with that. But remember that the Talmudic jurisprudence, what we call halacha, is all flowing from the Tanaim and Amoraim, and even though you have so many versions, the Rambam, Mishnah, Torah, and Shulchan Aruch, it all comes from there. It's all Talmudic, and that's where halacha really is based on. So I think we will wrap up right now with my monologue. If people are still awake, I'm thankful that they are. After you took toothpicks to keep your eyelids open, it's a good idea. And there may be some questions or whatever, by all means, we can talk about next. Okay.
If the stuff were written down, do we have anything at all left? That's why I asked the question whether it was written down.
Do we have anything?
Written. You got parchments from ancient...
Oh, actual text?
Actual texts.
I don't know. There may be archaeologists and fancy people who can tell you that they have in the museum of whatever, something. You know, the museums in the Middle East are unstable. The most beautiful stuff from thousands of years old. The mob comes in, trashes Baghdad or whatever they're doing, and you never know where the stuff got to, but I can't tell you that. There are people who work in this sort of thing.
An alternative explanation might be that it was actually organized by him, but not written down. And that's a different approach.
Well, as far as I think most of us understand, the Mishnah that we have printed, whether it's in Kahati or whatever, is wording that was approved, blessed, consecrated by Rabbi Yonasi. Okay, that wording could be some text that he had to fill in himself, which I'm sure he had to do here and there when he wanted to deal with something and there wasn't something to hand, and perhaps 60-70%, I'm guessing, would have been a text that private scrolls gave him from Tanoim, you know, a generation before, 2 generations before, 3 generations before. Well, it takes you a lot of years, a lot of centuries. And in the course of that, where he found, he could adapt it and say, now it's canonized, now it's official. And where he didn't find, he said, okay, let me add whatever. And you have discussions in Gemara, Zu Mishnah Rishona. However, Lachreim, they said something else, they changed it. So there are layers, historical layers in Mishnah, which are occasionally discussed when we see that, well, the Mishnah says that, but that was the old version. But now we hold otherwise. So there is some kind of development and a consensus that, you know, you have, for example, with Achilas Truma, of an Arusas Kohen. Arusas Kohen, she can eat Truma after 1 year. If the marriage hasn't happened, give her Truma. Achreim, they said, no, we can't do this. We can't do that because Shema Ta'achil V'del, Shema T'yimtzo Simpon, all that kind of stuff. So therefore, you cannot allow the woman under any circumstances to eat Truma because she is Kinyan Kaspo of the Kohen. You can't allow that because, you know, things can happen and we'll find the Zor eating Truma and anyway. So that's as much as I can do, I think, on that particular direction.
And the things written by Rabbi were literally written by him or by a team under him that
I think he had scribes. He was a rich guy, which is important. No, but I'm saying that a lot of work that has to be done on a massive basis requires people carrying texts from whatever and so on. And I'm sure he has scribes working with his own. He would check it over and so on. I mean, this is a massive, massive thing. The Mishnah is big. But the Mishnah is the basis of both Talmudic, you know, Yerushalmi Talmud and the Babylonian. But he had people. Wealth enables you, it's a resource, enables you to hire people and get people to carry stuff and to write stuff and to, you know, and to recopy and to whatever. Get a question? Undoubtedly. No. So how did the Romans get destroyed? The people came from Scandinavia, you know, and they came down into the Roman Empire, and they crossed the big river and nobody stopped them. They crossed the mountains and nobody stopped them. They came to Rome and nobody stopped them either. So they just trashed the place, and they're called ever after vandalism.
Barbarians at the gates.
Barbarians, yes, that's right. The people who were hired as mercenaries were also barbarians. So how much motivation did they have to defend the empire in its dying days? You know, when the vandals came, you know, to trash the place. So the hired guys, have a good time. Didn't bother them any.
This was in Europe.
Yeah,
Europe was the emperor there.
Europe today is the same situation. Okay, are we
Okay.
done? Ladies and
Thank
gents,
you.
thank you very much. I hope that these things will eventually be available in some fashion, and I think Rabbi Talmud is in touch with a lot of people. Eventually we'll have links and, links on North American Wildcats. Anyway, and try to figure out how to see these things online. I know that Ellie's boys would like to see this, but hopefully they'll see it afterwards and have a look. One of the guys had foot treatment today, so he couldn't come. He's going to come. So he says, if it's very important, I'll come. He said, my foot hurts me. I said, listen, go home, take it easy. Well, you'll look at it in a couple of weeks. Okay, thank you very much. Okay.